Good morning. Today we're going to be reading a book together. I'm not going to tell you the title because later I'm going to ask you to think of the main idea and make up your own title. I'm not going to be showing you any illustrations today because I'm going to ask you to visualize or to put a picture in your head using only the words. We're going to be taking some notes on the setting, which is where and when the story takes place, as well as a description of it. I'm not going to tell you who the author is because I'm going to ask you to infer or make inferences about what type of person the author might be. I'm going to ask you to predict what happens next in the story based on what's already happened. And we're going to start some comparing and contrasting for a little project later in the week. We're going to look at synonyms, which are words that have more or less the same meaning as another word, because I think that will help us when we look at context clues or parts of the sentence that help us understand words that we may not know. And finally, we're going to be looking at some proper nouns, more specifically names, and how they can be our friend when we're reading. So, ready or not, let's get started.
In the spring, I helped my mother start our garden. We used tall shovels to turn the grass upside down, and I saw pink worms wiggle around. It was hard work. When we stopped to rest, we saw that the neighbors were starting their gardens too.
What can you tell me about the setting of the story so far? Remember, the setting is where the story is taking place. It's also when the story is taking place. And there can also be a description, like it's a hot or cold or dark or spooky. As you listen to this page again, I want you to think about the setting, and whatever you come up with, write it in the chat.
In the spring, I helped my mother start our garden. We used tall shovels to turn the grass upside down, and I saw pink worms wiggle around. It was hard work. When we stopped to rest, we saw that the neighbors were starting their gardens too.
Very good. Many of you noticed that the story must be taking place outside. More specifically, it's taking place in their yard because they're planting a garden. Some of you even noticed that it's taking place in the spring because the story starts by saying in the spring. Because everybody seems to be having time to work in their yard, I'm going to infer that it might be Saturday, and I have a feeling that it's nice out. Let's continue reading.
Hello, Irma, my mother called to Miss Crummarine. Miss Crummarine was digging too. She was using a small shovel, one that fit in her hand. Mommy, I asked, why are we using such big shovels? Miss Crummarine has a small one. Because our garden needs more digging, she said.
What is being compared and contrasted on this page? As you listen again, I want you to think about what is being compared and contrasted and write it in the chat.
Hello, Irma, my mother called to Miss Crummarine. Miss Crummarine was digging too. She was using a small shovel, one that fit in her hand. Mommy, I asked, why are we using such big shovels? Miss Crummarine has a small one. Because our garden needs more digging, she said.
Very good. We can use a Venn diagram to show what we're comparing and contrasting. We can show what the mother does on one side and contrast it to the neighbors on the other side. And in the middle, we can write what they both do the same. Well, they were both digging. The difference is that the mother was using a big shovel and the neighbors were using small shovels. Before we continue, I just would like to point out some proper nouns, more specifically, names. Very often when we are reading, We can encounter a name that we've never seen before. We shouldn't let this discourage us. We can keep reading as long as we know it's a name and we can recognize it as a character. Mrs. Crumerine could be actually pronounced many different ways. Mrs. Crummerin or Mrs. Crumerini. If you were reading to yourself, maybe you could just call her Miss Crum. As long as you can place the character and recognize if she comes up again, you can continue reading. There are some clues that this is a proper noun or a name. For example, it starts with Mrs. The abbreviation MRS stands for Mrs., and that means it's a name. In addition, all proper nouns start with a capital letter. Sometimes first names can be hard to read too. Irma also starts with a capital letter, and that would be Mrs. Crumerine's first name. Let's continue reading the story.
I helped my mother plant seeds, and we dragged the hose to the garden. Hi, Linda. Hi, Mickey. I called to the Fitzgeralds. They were sprinkling water on their garden with green watering cans. Mommy, I asked, why are we using a hose? Linda and Mickey use watering cans. Because our garden needs more water, she said.
You may have noticed some proper nouns on this page, like Linda, Mickey, or the Fitzgeralds. Again, they all start with a capital, and they're all neighbors. But what about those neighbors? What is being compared and contrasted on this page? As you listen to this page again, think about what's being compared and contrasted and write it in the chat.
I helped my mother plant seeds, and we dragged the hose to the garden. Hi, Linda. Hi, Mickey. I called to the Fitzgeralds. They were sprinkling water on their garden with green watering cans. Mommy, I asked, why are we using a hose? Linda and Mickey use watering cans. Because our garden needs more water, she said.
Very good. Both the mother and the neighbors are watering their gardens, but the mother is using a hose and the neighbors are using a watering can. As you listen to the next page, I'd like you to give me a thumbs up if you notice any proper nouns.
Then my mother drew funny pictures on pieces of paper, and I stuck them into the garden. Hello, Roseanne, my mother called across the street to Mrs. Angel Howe. Mommy, I asked, why are we sticking these papers in the garden? Miss Angel Howe has seed packets in her garden. Because our garden is going to grow Chinese vegetables, she told me. These are the names of the vegetables in Chinese, so I can tell which plants are growing where.
Good job. Miss Angel Howe is a proper noun, and her first name is Roseanne, and she is a neighbor. But what is being compared and contrasted on this page? Raise your hand if you have an idea. So yes, everybody is labeling their garden, but the neighbors are using seed packets, and Mother is writing in Chinese. Do you see a pattern happening on these pages? Can this pattern help you to predict what might happen next? Let's stop and make a prediction. You should click on the link in the chat. That'll take you to a doc. You should find your name and write a prediction. Can you use what's been happening to predict what might happen next? You will have 4 minutes to write. Then I will turn off the doc. Click on the link now. We're always making predictions in our minds, whether we write them down or not. It's not important if our predictions are right or wrong, but sometimes it's interesting to see what we're using to make our predictions. Because the main character has been comparing and contrasting things on every page, I figured the next page would be the same. Let's listen and find out.
One day, I saw our garden growing. Little green stems that looked like grass had popped out from the ground. Our garden's growing, I yelled. Our garden's growing. I rushed over to the neighbors' gardens to see if theirs had grown. Their plants looked like little leaves. Mommy, I asked, why do our plants look like grass? The neighbors' plants look different. Because they're growing flowers, she said. Why can't we grow flowers? I asked. These are better than flowers, she said.
So what was being compared and contrasted on this page? Raise your hand if you have an idea. So yes, on this page, everybody's garden is growing, but Mother's garden looks like grass and the neighbors' gardens look like little leaves. Let's continue reading.
Soon all the neighbors' gardens were up and down the street grew rainbows of flowers. The wind always smelled sweet, and butterflies and bees flew everywhere. Everyone's garden was beautiful, except for ours.
What were the neighbors' gardens doing? What are some words that we could fit in that box? Listen again as I read the sentence. Think about words that could go in that box and write them in the chat. Soon all the neighbors' gardens were blank. Up and down the street grew rainbows of flowers. Yes, growing or opening would fit in these boxes because later in the sentence it says that down the street grew rainbows of flowers. So we know the neighbors' gardens weren't dying because of the rest of the sentence. Another way to say growing or opening is blooming. Growing or opening could be synonyms for blooming. Let's continue the story.
Ours was all dark and green and ugly. Why didn't we grow flowers? I asked again. These are better than flowers, Mommy said again. I looked, but saw only black, purple, green vines, fuzzy, wrinkled leaves, prickly stems, and a few little yellow flowers. I don't think so, I said. You wait and see, Mommy said.
There are no sentence-level context clues for the word wrinkled, but maybe when we see the illustrations, that will show us what wrinkled means. All we can tell here is that it's probably not a good thing because everything described is not good. If you take a brand new piece of paper and crumble it up and then straighten it out again, you'll see that it's all wrinkled. Let's continue.
Before long, our vegetables grew. Some were big and lumpy. Some were thin and green and covered with bumps. Some were just plain icky yellow. They were ugly vegetables. Sometimes I would go over to the neighbors and look at their pretty gardens. They would show the poppies and peonies and petunias to me. And I would feel sad that our garden wasn't as nice.
On this page, the word plain could mean just about anything. The only help we get is the word just, because plain means ordinary or just regular. Do you think we can add anything to our setting chart? The story is still taking place outside in the yard, but the author's been talking a lot about the rest of the neighborhood. And now that all the flowers are blooming, it's getting into summer. And the author is giving us a lot of description about the setting. We know it's beautiful, except for ours, and we know the air smells sweet. Back on the first page, I didn't realize the story was going to take place over such a long amount of time, so I'm going to take out my inference of Saturday. And if everybody's flowers are blooming, it must have rained out a couple times, so I'm going to take out my inference of being nice out. Let's continue.
One day, my mother and I picked the vegetables from the garden. We filled a whole wheelbarrow full of them. We wheeled them to the kitchen. My mother washed them and took out a big knife and started to chop them. Ay-yow, she said when she cut them. She had to use all her. The vegetables were hard and.
What are some words that could fit in these boxes? Listen as I read again. Think about words that could fit in those boxes and write them in the chat. Ay-yow, she said when she cut them. She had to use all her blank. The vegetables were hard and blank. Good. If you said she used all her strength or all her might, that would be right. And if the vegetables were hard and solid or hard and strong, those would be good synonyms also. I think the biggest context clue here is the word hard, because if the word were something else, like stinky, for example, she might instead need to use willpower to chop those gross things. Ay, yow, she said as she cut them. She had to use all her willpower. The vegetables were stinky and gross. But the word is not stinky, it's hard, so she needs her strength, her muscles, because the vegetables are hard and tough. Ay, yow, she said as she cut them. She had to use all her muscles. The vegetables were hard and tough. Let's continue.
This is Showengawa, Mommy said, handing me a bumpy, curled vegetable. She pointed at other vegetables. This is Shinsai. That's Thong Hao.
This part of the story, the author gives us Chinese words. And because they know we're not going to understand them, they show us how to pronounce them within parentheses. This tells us exactly how to say it. And you would only say the word once. Let's continue.
I went outside to play. While I was playing catch with Mickey, a magical filled the air. I saw the neighbors standing on their porches with their eyes closed, smelling the sky. They took deep breaths of air, like they were trying to eat the smell.
What are some words that might go in that box? Raise your hand if you have an idea. If you thought smell, that would be a good synonym. The word is aroma, and aroma is a really nice smell. The context clues here would be that it filled the air and that people were smelling the sky. Keep this word aroma, which means good smell, in mind because you might want to use it really soon.
The wind carried it up and down the street. Even the bees and the butterflies seemed to smell the in the breeze. I smelled it too. It made me hungry, and it was coming from my house.
What are some words that might fit in that box? Raise your hand if you have an idea. If you were thinking aroma, well, good for you for using a new word so quickly. The actual word is scent, and scent would be a synonym for aroma. The context clues here would be that somebody smelled it and it was in the breeze. Let's continue.
When I followed it to my house, my mother was putting a big bowl of soup on the table. The soup was yellow and red and green and pink. This is a special soup, Mommy said, and she smiled. She gave me a small bowl full of it, and I tasted it. It was so good. The flavors of the soup seemed to dance in my mouth and laugh all the way down to my stomach. I smiled. Do you like it? Mommy asked me. I nodded and held out my bowl for some more. It's made from our vegetables, she told me.
What are some words that might fit inside that box? Listen as I read again. Think about words that might fit in the box and write it in the chat. She gave me a small bowl full of it, and I tasted it. It was so good. The flavors of the soup seemed to dance in my mouth and laugh all the way down to my stomach. I smiled. Do you like it? Mommy asked me. I blank and held out my bowl for some more. It's made from our vegetables, she told me. If you wrote said yes or shook head up and down, you're right, those would be good synonyms. The word is actually nodded, which is when you shake your head upside down, up and down. The context clues here would be that she held out her bowl for some more. That lets you know that she was doing something that means yes. I like it. Let's read on.
Then the doorbell rang, and we ran to open the door. All our neighbors were standing at the door, holding flowers. "We noticed you were cooking," Mr. Fitzgerald laughed as he held out his flowers. "And we thought maybe you might be interested in a trade?" We laughed too, and my mother gave them each their own bowl of her special soup. My mother told them what each vegetable was and how she grew it. She gave them the soup recipe and put some in jars for them to take home. I ate 5 bowls of soup. It was the best dinner ever. The next spring, when my mother was starting her garden, we planted some flowers next to the Chinese vegetables. Miss Crummerine, the Fitzgeralds, and the Angel Howells planted some Chinese vegetables next to their flowers. Soon the whole neighborhood was growing Chinese vegetables in their gardens. Up and down the street, little green plants poked out of the ground. Some looked like leaves, some looked like grass, and when the flowers started blooming, you could smell the soup in the air. The end.
The man reading the story today is not the author. He did not write this book. But what can you infer about the author of this story? Do you think it's a man or a woman? What nationality do you think they are? Where do you think they come from? How do you know these things? What have you read that leads you to believe what you believe about the author? So think about who might write a story like this and put your answers in the chat. I will read some of them aloud. If you agree and have a reason to add, give a thumbs up and I'll call on you. If you disagree and have a reason, put a thumbs down and I'll call on you. Meet the author and illustrator, Grace Lin. Now, I covered the title of this book because I don't want you to know it yet, but it says that this book tells a true story of something that happened to Grace Lin when she was little. The book caused a big problem in her family because she didn't include her 2 sisters in it. They made her promise to put them in her other books, which she has done. Dim Sum for Everyone and Kite Flying are about a family with 3 girls, just like the Lin family. Notice how the titles of the books are in italic, and they have all capital letters. Speaking of titles, what do you think would be a good title for this story? Try to think about the main idea of the whole story and come up with a good title. Click on the link in the chat and go to Jamboard and write your title on a sticky note. Don't forget to put your name. The boys can go on the first page and the girls can go on the second page. I will give you 4 minutes and then turn the page off. Click on the link now. Good job. The actual title of this story is The Ugly Vegetables. Now we're going to go to our assignment and see how much we learned today. We'll start by clicking on Instructions and then the blue link. I'll meet you there.